Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, S. Robert Powell, the author of The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company.
Robert Powell, author of The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company Gravity Railroad. If somebody buys this, what do they get?
They get a very complex series of DVDs about a railroad company that transformed American life. The first 5 volumes in the series are about the technological aspects of the railroad that was rebuilt 5 times in the course of the 19th century. The other volumes in the series embellish the picture of the railroad as it expanded throughout northeastern Pennsylvania and into New York and elsewhere. And it's a very broad picture of society. Later in the series, there's going to be a volume. I'm looking forward to doing that. I'm calling it The Quality of Life in I'm not sure what exact title I might have in mind, but it's on quality of life. And so that will be the life associated with people working on the railroad, and there's more to it than just the technological coal mining and the dirty hands kind of aspect of coal mining. There's the life as it goes on in a civilized, urbane kind of way. That volume will be very interesting to write on because the subject has never been written on. A lot of people seem to get a lot of energy out of we were poor and lived in a tar paper shack and life was awful, but that's not true. I mean, life was rough, lots of medical problems, but life was good. People came here from all over Western Europe to start life over again. They came here to better themselves. They didn't come here for worse conditions. They came here for better conditions, and so life was good. If you worked hard, it'll be better for your children than it was for you. And so there's a very optimistic kind of pull to that volume. But there are other aspects of the D&H which have never really been focused on in detail, and I'm going to focus on many of those aspects in the upcoming volumes.
Now, first of all, this isn't in book form. This is in CD form, as you said. Well, why go this way instead of in a traditional book? This format appeals to me greatly because of the capacity for photographs and maps and charts and things, and it's good for me putting it together, but it's also good for the reader because depending on the capacity, the electronic capabilities of the owner's hardware, you could look at them on a screen that's 2 feet by 4, or you could look at them on a small desktop, so that and there are lots of photographs in it, and I like the expandability of it. I mean, it's easy to revise, easy to make additions to, and I love the compact nature of it all. It's quite wonderful to know that there are, in the first 10 volumes, several thousand pages, and you can sort of hold it in one hand, or you can put it on your flash drive, and there it is, the size of your thumb, several thousand pages. Well, I tallied up, it's 1,362 pages in this the volumes 6 through 10. What is it about the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad Canal that is so historically important that it merits this kind of volume?
Most of these aspects of the railroad have never really been written on. There's a lot of new material. There's a lot of, for example, volume 6 on water power. No one has ever written a word on water power and its use on the gravity railroad. One thinks of water power, one thinks of canals and grist mills and this kind of thing, but I mean they used. There were half a dozen of these planes on the railroad that had gigantic water wheels that provided the energy to get the coal up these inclined planes and to market. The discovery of water wheels on the railroad was really remarkable. A woman by the name of Jane Gritman was a very academically minded lady in the 19th century, kept lots of scrapbooks and things, and she had a way of organizing that makes it's wonderful for historians to look at, because she has things grouped by topic in many cases. At one point, the local newspapers organized a series of these sort of short, 2-paragraph articles. What is it? What do you know about this? The railroad was making a coal pocket. It's a coal retail structure in Carbondale, and they started making excavations to put the foundation for this building in. And they thought, what on earth have we come across? They ran into something as they were digging in the ground. What they discovered was a gigantic water wheel that had been buried, and this stimulated several articles in the newspaper. Does anybody know what this water wheel is that we've just dug up at the base of Salem Avenue? Anybody know anything about it? And then all manner of experts came forward saying, oh yes, it was this and it was that, and then back and forth. And finally, the appropriate people came forward and said, I helped, operate a plane that had a water wheel on it, and let me tell you what this was all about. And so that opened the door to the whole subject of water power on the Gravity Railroad. And I then reversed myself and started looking at earlier maps and earlier documents from the point of view, is there something on water wheels or water power that I've been overlooking? And I was astonished to look at maps that I had studied carefully from the point of view of rail lines and streets and things. So if you focused on rails as you're looking at a map, you're looking for the traditional, what a railroad would look like. Suddenly I was looking at the same map from the point of view of looking for waters and waterways and raceways and canals and things. And suddenly they were all there that I wasn't seeing on my first go-around, because I wasn't expecting them to be useful in a kind of connected to the railroad. And so then that just opened the door, and I kept going in one direction after another, trying to find out more about it. And then I in fact did uncover a lot of material on the water wheels. And
well, this is your second time on this program, but for people who didn't see the first one, can we talk about some of the basics? It's got a couple of key words in the title: gravity, canal, railroad, and incline. Can you talk about how the whole system worked?
Yes, the coal cars were brought in on a level to the base of an inclined plane, and then the inclined plane was like an old-fashioned sort of roller coaster, or maybe a modern one too. The cars were hooked onto a cable at the base of the plane and pulled up the inclined plane by a stationary engine, which was at the top of the plane. The engines were stationary, and the cars moved to the end. At the top of the plane, the cars were disconnected from the cables. Then they sort of coasted on a level between the head of one plane and then the foot of the next one. And then they were attached again to a cable and then pulled up the next inclined plane. So it was like a series of steps. They were being pulled up a mountain. And the obstacle was getting the coal cars from the valley floor in the Lackawanna Valley, getting them 1,000 feet in the air to the top of the Moosic Mountain above Carbondale. And so they were pulled up and up and up. So inclined planes and then levels, and then the stationary engines were at the heads of the planes.
How far would they drift when they were rolling free?
Well, it varied. Each plane, on some planes, if the grade of the mountain was rather steep, there would be a short level, and then they would connect them up again. Sometimes there were a couple of levels that were like 20 miles long, where the cars just coasted for like 20 miles.
But it was a slow, gradual?
A slow, gradual process, until they got up to the top of the mountain. And then on the top of the mountain, they lowered the cars. They were attached to cables to lower the cars. And then they lowered them down like down a series of steps. At the base of the mountain, on the other side of the mountain at Waymart, the cars then coasted 10 miles into Honesdale, where the coal cars were then emptied into canal boats. And a canal functions by gravity as did this railroad, because the canal boats go into a lock. The water is let out of the lock, then the canal boat goes down. So it's like a step. So a canal from the top of the mountain above Carbondale all the way to the Hudson River, 118 miles, the locks in the canal, essentially the boats were going down these inclines. So the whole system from the mines to the Hudson River functioned in terms of gravity, because the railroad was functioning by gravity and the canal functions by gravity. They had to work very hard to get the coal cars to the top of the mountain, but once they got the cars to the top of the mountain, it was largely a free ride from there to the Hudson River, 120 miles away. So it was an amazing use of energy and using natural forces and the weight of the coal to provide its own forward momentum.
A little more specifics about when and where. Where's Carbondale and when was this all taking place?
This all began on October 9, 1829. Carbondale is at the head of the Lackawanna Valley. The Lackawanna Valley and the Wyoming Valley, that includes Carbondale, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, so northeastern Pennsylvania. And this property became a part of the Wirtz brothers acquired much of this property. These were Philadelphia dry goods merchants who provided military uniforms to the federal government in the War of 1812, and in payment for their products, for the uniforms, they were given what I think probably the donors thought of, given that land in northeastern Pennsylvania. It's nothing but trees and woodchucks and nothing else. Who wants it? So they sort of give this land to them. And the Wirtz brothers were happy to accept it, and as it turns out, they had the last laugh, because they were given essentially the largest anthracite deposit in North America, 484 square miles of coal, millions and trillions of dollars worth of coal, which at the time nobody knew how to burn it properly, so there was a whole learning process. How do you burn anthracite coal? It's not just like, you can't just sort of hold a match to it. You've got to have the right amount of air around the coal in order to get coal to burn. But anyhow, it was land given to the Wirtz brothers by the government, and it turned out to be quite a wonderful gift. And this was all in northeastern Pennsylvania. It's a very finite area of anthracite coal, and there's anthracite coal elsewhere in America, but it's the largest deposit in North America. And that was what they then had. That was the product they were to market. The southern part of the coal field, that coal was being taken down rivers like the Delaware to Philadelphia. But the Wirtz brothers controlled the northern part of the coal field, and so they had to find a separate market, because the southern market was controlled by operators in the southern part of the coal field. So they set their eyes on New York as a target for their market. And in order to get their coal to market, they had to create this technology, get this canal and this railroad over this mountain initially. And the remarkable thing about these Wirtz brothers and the people that they were working with is that they and this was really characteristic of the D&H from the beginning of the century on. They knew enough to get the right people involved to solve their problems for them. They were excellent managers. They literally recruited in building the canal, the construction team for the Erie Canal in upstate New York. The Erie Canal had just been finished in 1825, and at that point, the Wirtz brothers recruited the Benjamin Wright and John Jarvis and other people, James Archibald, who were part of the technological skill package associated with the Erie Canal, and they brought them to northeastern Pennsylvania. So it's like this amazing Erie Canal, and then even before the Erie Canal was finished, that same crew was working on the D&H Canal.
Had anything like this been done before with all the inclines and pulleys?
In America, there were two other examples that were rudimentary expressions of the same principle. But in Jim Thorpe, there was an inclined plane where cars were lowered down just one plane. It was a tram road essentially. The cars sort of coasted down, and then they were pulled up another plane. It wasn't a complete system like the D&H had in Carbondale. And there was also a tram railroad at Breeds Hill, Massachusetts, that was established when they were making the Bunker Hill Monument. to get the granite from the quarries down to the water level to get to get the granite to the site where the Bunker Hill Monument now stands. So, but they were both largely the same principles, but on a very restrained scale, one plane, like he said. But this was such the unusual thing about what the D&H did was it was such a complete system, 125 miles long from the coal mines to the Hudson River. The thing which really strikes me as being, in dozens of ways, the D&H is remarkable. One of the most remarkable things about this transportation system they created is it is in a way an expression of Henry Ford and his production line, 100 years before Henry Ford. And I say that because the miners were in the mines getting the coal, putting it in a coal car. They handed off that coal to someone who connected the coal car to a mule and pulled it to point B. The person at point B handed it off to somebody who got it up a plane in the mines and got it out. And then from the mines, it was taken by another group of people to the base of, shall we say, plane number 1. And there were people that there was a footman at the base of plane. There were footmen at the base of each plane. At the base of plane number 1, there was a footman whose only job was to connect the coal cars to the cable and send them on their way. There was a headman at the top of the plane whose job it was to disconnect the cars. So what the principle involved is that the workers were stationary and the work came to them, which is the Henry Ford thing, the conveyor belt. So what we had operating in Carbondale in 1829 was like a 125-mile long conveyor belt, because the workers were all stationary. They lived along this whole transportation system. And their work came to them. They did their thing and handed it off to somebody else. That's really that's a remarkable achievement in American technology and in American history, that it happened so early.
You say in your book, at the introduction to each of these chapters, each of these volumes, that the Industrial Revolution started in Carbondale, Pennsylvania, and you give a specific date.
October 9, 1829. It's always hard to assign a specific date. When did the Reformation begin? When did the Renaissance begin? That kind of, the temptation to come up with a date is always great. And on that particular day, I mean, trumpets didn't go off and somebody said, "No, we have just begun." That didn't happen, of course. But what I mean by that statement in the broadest sense is that the anthracite coal that was taken out of the Lackawanna and Wyoming valleys in northeast Pennsylvania made possible the industrialization of America. Without that coal, it would not have happened, because America at that point was in the midst of its first energy crisis. All of the trees essentially around all urban centers had been cut down. If there's a wood-burning stove in your world, you know how quickly a wood pile can disappear. It doesn't take long for a gigantic mountain of wood to disappear on a cold winter season. And so all around large cities, all the trees had been cut down. There was no fuel. And America was in the midst of this energy crisis. And the War of 1812 worsened it all, because the blockade of the eastern seaboard by the British made it impossible to import coal. Could have been imported from Great Britain, some coal, but that would hardly take care of the needs for the eastern United States. And there were also coal fields in Virginia, but that wouldn't have provided enough. That coal couldn't be brought into New England and to New York and Philadelphia and New England to make it to take care of their energy needs. So they literally were without a fuel, and fortuitously, this anthracite coal was discovered and then marketed in New York, and it was a huge success. I mean, the Wirtz brothers were such good marketing people. They took several tons of coal to New York, and they heated this one coffee shop, the Tontine Coffee Shop on Wall Street, and then invited investors in to sort of get nice and warm in this warm coffee shop heated by anthracite coal. On one day, one afternoon in 1825, they sold $1.5 million worth of stock. It was the largest privately funded enterprise in American history to that point. I mean, it was one afternoon in 1825, and that's $1.5 million, not in our currency, but in their currency. So whatever the multiple might be in terms of what do you multiply that by, 100 times or 200 to get the equivalent in modern day dollars, but but $1.5 million in 1825 currency to finance finance their enterprise. And so everybody realized immediately that this coal was the answer to a problem. And with the coal now as a domestic fuel and as an industrial fuel, things began to happen big time. And so industrialization happened because the coal could now be used in all sorts of manufacturing contexts. And with this, it made it possible for the economy of America to change from essentially an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. And that transformation from agrarian to industrial was made possible by the coal from the Lackawanna and Wyoming valleys. So that all of that sort of leads me to that one statement about it began on October 9, 1829. I know it's a nervy sort of thing to say, but in a way it's sort of a symbolic date because it sort of crystallizes a beginning of a process. And I think the process of providing a fuel for America is an important moment. And when those first cars left on October 9, it was the beginning of a whole new American adventure. And that coal not only went to New York. When the coal went from Carbondale to Rondout on the Hudson River, and then it was taken down the river. Most of it was taken down the river to New York City. A lot of it was taken up the Hudson River as well to Albany. Some of it was transshipped through the Champlain Canal up into Lake Champlain into Canada, from the very earliest. A lot of it was taken down to New York and then out into the Atlantic Ocean and shipped up the East Coast to Providence and Boston. This is in the 1820s. The D&H they were so good at market development. They sent it down the eastern seaboard and as far as New Orleans. In the 1820s, they were shipping coal to test markets and to establish markets as far as New Orleans. So coal was going everywhere. It was going up the Hudson River to Albany and was being transshipped through the Erie Canal to the American Midwest. Everybody needed a fuel, and this coal was the answer.
Was Carbondale the headquarters of the company?
It was.
Why Carbondale?
Well, that was where the railroad went over the mountain, and that was where the company really started. All the coal from the Lackawanna and the Wyoming valleys initially came up the Lackawanna Valley to Carbondale to get over the mountain. That was the big obstacle. Get over that mountain. How are you going to do it? And that's the reason for the gravity railroad.
What was the town like at its peak of industrial might?
At its peak, at the end of prior to like World War II, Carbondale was like a boom town. It was unbelievable prosperity. There was a high level of civilization in there. In addition to the industrial world that was all around it. I mean, it was a very, very thriving, vibrant industrial city.
Was there a lot of wealth?
There was a lot of wealth. There are still an amazing. The architectural heritage of the coal mining era is strong and still there. There are spectacular houses, 15, 18-room, gorgeous Victorian houses. Some of them designed by named architects. There was one designed by Andrew Jackson Downing, still there, in the middle of essentially a 10-acre park in the middle of town, designed by Downing, and surrounded by a stone wall and a beautiful park environment, and many beautiful houses that are still there, and there was a level of civilization and culture that was just one would not believe associated with all this industrial stuff going on around it.
Was there a fancy social scene, like a social elite, like John O'Hara would write about?
There was indeed. There was in fact, that social elite interestingly enough, played a very key role in the establishment of passenger service on this railroad.
One of your discs,
which is
volume 8.
Volume 8. The passenger service started because the sons and daughters of some of these wealthy railroad barons thought it would be sort of fun to ride up on the mountain on these cars and sort of for the adventure of it all. Other people did too, but they started out riding on these sort of makeshift sort of passenger vehicles that were they were sort of like glorified coal cars, but it became sort of a social event, kind of a game sort of thing. They would stop the coal cars. These folks would go off and pick flowers or picnic and so on. There was an obsession in the 19th century with picking mayflowers, arbutus, trailing arbutus. And a lot of these, I have some most wonderful clippings where the names of 15 socialites would go to the mountain to pick mayflowers. And there were no passenger stations. They would stop these cars, they would get off and go into the woods, spend the afternoon, then they would get back, they would stop coal cars, they would get on, and then they'd bring them back to town. Finally, the D&H decided this is really we can capitalize on this. People are having a lot of fun riding this new means of transportation. And they then began to build these passenger vehicles, some of which they became more elaborate as the century went on. And one of the very interesting spin-offs of all this is that the railroad, as the railroad was developing its technology to get more coal into the system to market, one of the things they decided to do was to detach the light track from the loaded track. The loaded track was the cars going to market. The light track was the empty cars coming back. They decided that they could increase their capacity for getting coal to market if they separated the two tracks. That would take me an hour and a half to explain all the details that made that possible. But in so doing, they detached the light track and they sort of sent it way up the valley, and so it curved came down in a very long, sinuous curve, but gradually following the ridgeline. And they took it very, very slowly down, so it was like almost a 20-mile roller coaster ride you could take. One of the things which made it especially appealing is that at one point a very famous section of the railroad was called Shepherd's Crook. And this was the railroad, the cars are coming down the mountain like this, then they curve around, out on an embankment, out into the valley, and then they curve back again and continue on their way. So that essentially you could be on the front end, you could see the front end of the train and the back end of the train. You could it looks like two different trains, but it's the same train going around a curve. Fortuitously, this Shepherd's Crook, as they called it, because of its shape, went through some of the most astonishing scenery. There's a falls. There's a Panther Creek, is what it's called, and it's right from the top of the mountain right down to the floor of the Lackawanna Valley, and it's a series of waterfalls. There are probably 5 or 6 at least. Unbelievably beautiful waterfalls, some of them, 100 feet high. They just come down the mountain in sort of steps over solid rock. And so these picnickers discovered these waterfalls, and so suddenly you got to go see the waterfalls. So suddenly there were a lot of people who wanted to go see the waterfalls, and they wanted to have the fun of riding around this Shepherd's Crook, which was a very unusual thing because you were coasting along silently through the woods, on these rail cars. And so that sort of opened the door to this business of getting passengers over the mountain. And people, even before passenger service was inaugurated in 1877, lots of these provisional cars were established to get people on the mountain to have a look at this. So then finally the D&H decided in 77 we can make money by putting passenger cars on this. So they put passenger cars on this line from Carbondale to Honesdale. And people came from all over to ride the railroad for the thrill of riding on the railroad and to see this beautiful scenery, because here you are on the top of this gorgeous mountain above the industrial valley below, and it was a beautiful sort of fresh air outdoor kind of experience. And people from 100 miles away came to Carbondale to ride on this gravity railroad. But all of this was stimulated by these sort of society ladies and gentlemen who wanted to go up on the mountain to sort of pick flowers and have a look at the scenery.
And it was an excursion and entertainment thing as opposed to real public transportation.
It was an entertainment thing. In fact, and the railroad was smart enough to develop a series of switchbacks where the cars they could go up to the area where the beautiful views were, and they could then, the cars, by a series of switching, could come back down. They didn't have to go the whole way to the Honesdale to turn around. It was sort of like, take this outing from here to point A, and then we'll switch you around and bring you back down to town. And then, based on that initial success with these outings to the mountain for picnics and things, they then developed passenger service, and then they quickly realized people were using that the passenger service became very popular between Carbondale and Honesdale, because the only way of getting between those two cities was by stagecoach, which took forever, and it was awful and dusty and dirty. And here we were riding on this in a reasonably genteel kind of structure vehicle over the mountain, silently through the woods to Honesdale, and they then. Became very popular. There were like 4 trains a day each way, passenger trains, people traveling between Carbondale and Honesdale. And
Well, how'd they get back? Because it would have been uphill going back.
well, they did the same principles they used getting there. They did them in reverse. They just pulled the cars. Initially, they had one track with sidings on it, and they had to pull. It was a very complex system of pulling cars around. Eventually they had 2 tracks, where one was the light track coming back, so that the passengers could come back on the light track. They could go on the loaded track and come back on the lighter track. It was a very intricate system of pulleys and tracks and things. But they then realized very quickly that there was money to be made with with passengers, even though the initial founders of the company didn't care at all about passengers. They were getting coal to market. But then this wonderful spin-off of it all, passenger service, they began to have groups of people traveling in large groups, 30, 40, 50 people wanting to go on one of these rides over the mountain. And so they were coming from far and wide to do this. And the D&H was making money because they were paying. These people were paying for the privilege of riding on these cars. But then the D&H decided, well, if they're willing to travel in groups like this and interested in traveling in groups like this, let's really capitalize on this. So they established on the top of the mountain a 600-acre picnic park, which is the subject of another volume here, Farview Park, which was an amazing thing on the top of the mountain, a 600-acre park. And in the park, there was a dancing pavilion, there were picnic tables, tennis courts, a couple of observatories.
Yeah, you have a big, tall observation tower.
Observation tower, from which you could see 17 lakes. You could see the Poconos. You could see it's a very high mountain, and you could get these unbelievable vistas from the top of the mountain. And people came from all over for the pleasure of going to this picnic destination on top of the mountain. And the D&H was selling tickets to go to Farview Park, which opened in 1885. They were selling tickets for parties traveling in groups of 1 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 200, from up to groups of, they had a special fare if you were traveling with 500 people or more to go to the top of the mountain. And these people were all paying from Carbondale at least 50 cents a person to ride to the top of the mountain. 50 cents for a ride to the top of the mountain in the 1870s was a lot of money. $1 a day was considered a very good wage. Many people in the 1880s would say that I can hear grandparents and others in my own family saying that Grandma and Grandpa got married when Grandpa was making $1 a day. They felt they could then make the big step and get married. So $1 a day was a wonderful wage, and yet they were willing to pay 50 cents a day to go to the top of the mountain, for 50 cents for a ride to the top of the mountain. So the D&H. At one point in the 1880s, they took 15,000 people in one day up to the top of the mountain for this park, a picnic park. People were getting out of the grimy, dirty industrial valley, and they were going to the top of the mountain for the pleasure of fresh air and outing. And church groups from everywhere, and fraternal and civic organizations. I come across newspaper articles that say things like, 350 scholars from the Sunday school of the First Presbyterian Church went to Farview on Tuesday. The numbers are hard to believe. 350 children from one church Sunday school going to the top of the mountain. And people came literally from suburban New York and for hundreds of miles all the way around the whole system to ride on this railroad because it was the first.
What were the boom years of the passenger side of it, the excursion side?
From after the Civil War up until really up to World War I.
Oh, that long.
It went on for quite a while. By the time into the 20th century, it continued because as many railroads did, they established a very wonderful amusement park at Lake Lodore, which was one of the lakes that the railroad went by. And so the railroads were very smart in doing this because, if people are going to go to the amusement park, they're going to ride your railroad to get there, so that they had the numbers of people who rode on these rail cars, even into the 30s. You could take a passenger train from Carbondale to Honesdale as late as 1930, and but the boom times were from the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, where it was the latest thing. It was all the rage, and people, the numbers are hard to believe, and so popular was as a destination. I find in 19th century newspapers lists of the excursions booked for April, and every day has got an excursion booked from all manner of civic and fraternal organizations throughout the whole summer. It was people were going to the fresh air and sunshine like people go to theme parks today. Everybody feels they have to go to some theme park halfway across America on their vacation. The same thing happened in the 19th century with this railroad, because all these people, these tens of thousands of people from all over Western Europe, were coming to the Lackawanna Valley and Wyoming Valley to work. Dirty, grimy, industrial stuff. But then weekends, on Saturday, off to the mountain they went, and so it was a very good balance of work and play. It wasn't all work and no play. They had a lot of the quality of their life was good. It was rough, lots of disease, lots of accidents. Life was not easy. However, life was good.
Did these cars have brakes?
They did have brakes. Each of the passenger cars had a braking system on them, a very elaborate system of turning wheels to stop them, and the cars were always under very good control, either by brakes or on cables.
So when it was carrying coal or people, it would have somebody on it operating the brakes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, each car had people in charge of braking. And on the way down the mountain, especially because there were these long passageways where they could have gone. They were like going for 20 miles without any ropes. They were freewheeling.
How did the water power fit into this? How did
the water wheels were put on several of these planes. The water wheels were established at the heads of the planes, and so the water wheel and with the water going through the wheel turning a series of gears, provided the power to pull the cars up to the top of the mountains. And the astonishing thing about some of the water wheels on these planes is that there's one plane just outside of Carbondale where there was a water wheel that is almost no one believes me, even though they believe me. They find it hard to believe that there was a water wheel there, because how do you get water from here to there? It's like and enough to power an engine. They were as clever as the Incas were, the way the Incas moved water through the Andes. They 10 miles away, they began a raceway off of a babbling brook, and they slowly took it along the edge of a mountain and took it around and way back. All of a sudden, it appears at the top of this mountain, because they followed the natural course of the water, but they started far enough upstream so they could get to the top of the mountain. And so then they established a pond at the top of the mountain, where the water from that pond then was sent by means of a raceway to the water wheel to get the water wheel going, and then that provided the power. And they had the 4 of the 5 planes between Honesdale and Carbondale had water wheels on them, and it's really remarkable. The source of the water. You look at it today, it's this babbling brook that's it's sometimes in the middle of the summer is like 3 feet wide and 4 inches deep, and that's all the water there is. But yet, if water is going downhill, if you have a certain amount of distance, you can create a pond. And then they stored the water, and then they set the water through a raceway, and then it fed into a wheel, and then the wheel went around, and it really is just remarkable.
How big were the wheels?
Some of them were gigantic. The one at the top of at plane number 1 was 50 feet in diameter. This huge wheel, this wooden water wheel, and there was one. There were 3 of them in downtown Carbondale, but that one of them they discovered when they were digging around to put that building in I mentioned earlier. That water wheel was just buried on the ground when they were no longer using water power. They just sort of knocked the wheel over and buried it, and it was there. But the water wheels there were 3 of them in downtown Carbondale that functioned by a canal. There was a canal that went through right through the middle of Carbondale. I think I am the only person who knows that. I take people to a map and I said, look, there it is. Believe me, trust me. And it's because it seems like such an unorthodox thing that there was a canal in the middle of Carbondale, but there was. I can prove it to you, and I think I have proved it. But on a map you can see. But the remarkable thing is where they got the water from, how they got the water to that canal, by this ingenious system of raceways and things to get the canal to get the power where they needed it, and it worked.
Is there any evidence of this today? If you go there poking around.
Yes, it would require someone to say, now if you look at that, you see that ditch there. That was the beginning of it's not really much. The untrained eye, you couldn't. Someone could show it to you, and then you would say, I see what you're talking about. But it's almost unbelievable, and because it's such an unorthodox thing for people to think that there was a canal in the middle of downtown Carbondale, but there was. And then there are people, and I'm always amused by it, and it's their intentions are good, but people say that some people who sort of like to offer these explanations of historical facts say, oh, that was the D&H Canal in Carbondale. Well, the D&H Canal didn't come into Carbondale. That started in Honesdale. This was an industrial canal in the Lackawanna Valley. So it looks like it was like a canal from Honesdale, but you can't take a canal really over a mountain that's 2,000 feet in the air without having 100 locks to get it over there, because that's a big rise for it.
How much of what's in all these pages is stuff that you wrote as opposed to documents that you reprint?
I would think it's at least certainly half of it. No, there's a lot of. I like to back things up with evidence all along the way, and I like to substantiate them so that to prove my point. I think the greatest contribution that I can think of with these is the synthesis, putting all these variables together. That's sort of evidence out there that hasn't been synthesized, and it's remarkable how quickly it all sort of goes away unless it's put together in a coherent whole. And I give it my best to try and make it into a meaningful whole. I think about people like Heinrich Schliemann when he was investigating the ruins of ancient Troy. He was confronting essentially a barren plain, and then he started digging down. He called this Troy 4, Troy 3, Troy 2. He kept getting down to the original. So it's like archaeology in your own hometown. It's like looking at your environment and seeing what's there, and it really takes a trained eye, because it's all been largely obliterated by the 20th century. But it is there, and you can prove it, but with appropriate trained eye. But the synthesis of all these documents, I think, is a very important contribution, and that is made possible by journalists in the 19th century who were astonishing writers. These people were not just writing social tidbits and weather reports. I mean, they're like 10-column articles in the newspaper about this, that, or the other, all relating to what's going on in our world around us.
You reprint a lot of that from the Carbondale Leader. There was a column called Gravity Notes.
Gravity Notes.
You have a lot of that in here. What kind of thing did you find in those columns?
Amazing facts. Those Gravity Notes, a weekly column of news and notes about gravity the Gravity Railroad, and I included that as a kind of appendix to it, as a source book. In a way, I sort of like to try and sort of create research documents at the same time. There's a lot of stuff in those Gravity notes and all those weekly newspaper columns, which appear at the end of each volume. That it's all new information. But the remarkable thing about those notes is that they contain facts and figures and data about the railroad that exists nowhere else.
A lot of information about accidents and people dying, gruesome deaths.
Exactly, yes. A lot of things like, John Smith was killed at the head of plane number 6 on Tuesday. That's an important fact to know, that John Smith was a headman at plane number 6. So I record that fact, so that fact can then be used in another context. And throughout those Gravity notes, there have been some remarkable, unbelievable stuff in them. Articles like, on Tuesday, 1,800 cars of coal were shipped from Carbondale. Just sort of a fact somebody would include in a monthly. That's very interesting to know. There was 1,800 cars of coal were shipped on a Tuesday, because in tabulation of data about it, and people record all kinds of things in those columns. A lot of it is about social life, and but there's a lot of technological things and accidents. And John Smith, who was formerly the headman at number 9, is now working at the footman on plane 6. I like to record those kinds of facts and just sort of record the fact, and then ultimately, if I live to be 200, I will incorporate that fact in volume 1, because it's learned after the fact. So I will. It's there to be incorporated at one point by me or maybe by somebody after me.
Are you a trained historian, or did you just sort of pick this up along the way?
I'm a literary historian. I taught for many years literature on a college level, and humanities and things. So I have a great appreciation for academic kinds of things and research. I mean, it's the greatest pleasure of my life. I love doing research. I work on this D&H stuff 4 or 5 hours every day. I must do it, and so it's I like to create these documents that are a synthesis on a particular topic, as well as being a research vehicle for other people or myself later on.
Do you have any plans to put this into a conventional book form? I mean, boil it down to
possibly, yes. In a way, I want to sort of blast my way through the whole 24 volumes and get it down, and then the pleasure of revision and addition and correction that can go on forever. But I like creating a research document. Now, for example, in many of these volumes, these current volumes, there's I've reprinted 50 or so pages in several of them, each of them, that are from this amazing document that came into our world a number of years ago. People leave things at our door at the Historic Society, like sort of a foundling at the doorstep.
That's in Carbondale?
In Carbondale. A box of stuff. Take it if you want it. I went through this box that looked like junk, and most of it was junk. But then there was this one object in the box that had been very carefully wrapped in aluminum foil, and it looked like a sort of store ledger. But somebody decided it was special for some reason or other. And when I picked it up, I thought, well, this is probably one of those 19th century ledgers where a merchant, Mrs. Jones, 2 pounds of tea, 9 cents, 1 loaf of bread, 3, that kind of a ledger, a store ledger. That would be interesting in itself, but I thought, I wonder what. I opened it, I looked at it, I thought, oh my gosh, this is a very unusual document. The quality of the paper was it had a high sort of rag content to it. It was good paper. I thought, what am I looking at? And I opened it up, and it was just like 80 or 90 page sort of ledger of some kind with all kinds of, I thought, what am I looking at? And I could see its boat number, and then there was listed, like, I could see lumber, and then I could see $25. I thought, what am I? Then I realized it was what it is. It is a ledger. It's the ledger book from the D&H Canal from 1832. It is every boat that left Honesdale. It was the ledger established by one man. It's the same scribe, the same hand through the whole thing. every boat that left the D&H Canal in Honesdale, he put the boat number, the captain's name, the quantity, the cargo, what it weighed, what it costs, and other details about the shipment. And and it's for the whole year, which is really there are at least 2 master's theses that could be done on this document itself, just because it's just raw data, but tons of it about the canal and what was shipped through the canal. And that came into our world just quite by accident. They were cleaning out a garage or whatever, and somehow this book had been hiding out for 100 years, wrapped in aluminum foil, maybe recently, but anyhow, there it was, and it's a remarkable treasure. So like these newspaper articles, these newspaper weekly columns, it's largely raw data, but it's a gold mine of raw data because it's all new stuff. Nobody's ever looked at it from a historical perspective.
Before we run out of time, I want to talk about this other one of your volumes that we haven't discussed, Working Horses and Mules on the Gravity Railroad. Did they use horses or mules to pull the cars up the hill?
Along the way, they did. They used them in the mines to pull the coal cars out of the mines. They used horses and mules to get the cars from the mines up to the surface level. They used horses and mules at the top of the levels, at the top of the plains, to move the cars from one level to the base of the next plane. They used horses essentially like switcher engines in the yards in both home, to move cars around. We would use sort of jeeps and so on today. They used these horses to move things on flat ground, and they used them all the way up until 1859. They ended animal power because it was more efficient to have machines doing this moving of coal. But there were thousands of mules that worked in the mines moving coal cars, and there were mule barns underground where 100 mules could be in a barn here, and then half a mile away another mule barn, because they needed all these mules to move the cars, to get the coal cars to the base of the plains.
And they lived underground.
Most of the time they lived underground. And
I learned from your book that keeping the animals underground full-time permanently as their home was made illegal in Pennsylvania in 1966.
Hallelujah. Yes, most of the mules were well taken care of by the miners and by the railroad because they needed them. They were like partners in getting the job done, and so they had to take care of them well. And mules on the canal, all the canal boats were pulled by mules and horses. Thousands of animals had to be used to make it possible to move this coal, and they were used as such until up to the time of the Civil War. And then machines began to use machines, but you don't have to. You have to provide some kind of fuel to a machine, but you don't have to feed it oats and hay, and you don't have to take care of it like you would a mule. But the mules, it's interesting that during the periodic strikes and labor things, the mules were taken up from below ground to above the ground. I'm always saying hooray for the mules, because the mules can get out of the mines into ordinary pastures. And
all right, unlike the engines, when there's a strike, you can't just shut them off.
That's right. So the mules had a holiday when they were taken out, but they came. There were thousands of them, and they were animal power in the 19th century was crucial to the operation of the nation. They used them even on streetcars. I mean, they had these tramways. They moved streetcars by pulling them with horses. They used horses and mules were a key part of the success of the D&H.
But going back to the gravity notes in the Carbondale newspaper, there were a lot of reports of people being kicked by horses and mules, or dying from being kicked.
They did, yes. I mean, and that's. I mean, mules are not inherently nasty. They become nasty because somebody was probably mistreating them, and or the conditions were not the best for the mule. So that but there were a number of people a lot of people were kicked by mules, and they almost always were described as being vicious. but they were
The
made.
people or the mules?
The mule was vicious. I think the people who treated the mules in an inhumane way might have been vicious, but the mules got the bad reputation for being nasty, and I was raised around horses and mules and things, and they're not inherently nasty. I think it's like dogs. Dogs are not inherently nasty either, I don't think, but they can be made nasty by treatment, and so that the mules got a bad rep sometimes. But
now, Volume 10, which we haven't gotten to yet, is the steam line from Carbondale to Scranton. Now, this was a conventional railroad that just went up and down the valley?
It was another offshoot of the gravity system went from Carbondale as far as Oliphant in 1859, and then they began to develop coal mines farther south in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and below. So they had to get that coal to Carbondale to get it over the mountain. So that's a remarkable. Another one of those only Robert knows this facts is that that the gravity railroad then went from Oliphant, from there all the way to Wilkes-Barre on flat ground, and they had gravity gauge steam locomotives, little small engines, pulling these coal cars from as far away as Wilkes-Barre all the way up the Lackawanna Valley to the foot of plane number 23 in Oliphant. Then they shipped the coal through this system, the existing system that they had, because Oliphant was the southern terminus of the canal, or the railroad. So, but all the coal from down the Lackawanna Valley was brought up to Oliphant, sent over the mountain through the gravity system. So literally gravity engines and gravity cars being used on flat land. They were being used like later steam locomotives on flat land, but they were gravity gauge. It means they had the narrower tracks. But then the steam line between Scranton and Carbondale was a passenger offshoot, the same way the passenger offshoot on the mountain, on the gravity line over the mountain, because people began, with all these people coming from all over the world, living in the valley. They were moving around the valley, and instead of taking stagecoaches and things, they decided they could then start taking. The railroad also established passenger cars, 1 or 2 passenger cars to the end of the line in the valley. It took off. It was a huge success. And so the next thing you know, they needed more car, and so they suddenly had the line at the valley line was largely initially passenger travel, because the coal was going through the gravity system, but the passengers were going on flat land. Then when they closed the gravity in '99, then this flat land.
1899.
Through the line through the valley, it was both passengers and freight, and that was the major. That was in the end of the 20th century. That was what this valley road became.
How long have you been working on this project?
For about 15 years, I think, at least. I began writing 9 years ago, and I now. I'm honest. The ball is rolling now. I've got myself into a work plan where it's. I'm now working on the 5 volumes that will come out in October of next year, and that's an interesting. I've got myself plugged into a process, and it's producing results, and I'm very happy with it, with the work method, but it's a broad story that has not been told, and it really has to be told because of the unbelievable innovations that the D&H came up with in the course of the 19th century to make possible what they made possible, this industrialization of America.
Well, I wish we could keep talking, but we're out of time. This is the cover of one of the DVDs we've been talking about. It's sort of like a book. The D&H, Delaware and Hudson Canal Company Gravity Railroad, and our author is Robert Powell. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.